Thank you, Marco, and thank you to everyone at the museum for having me. It's been a great long weekend and also last couple of days here. As Marco said, I'm going to kind of pivot what I was going to be talking about slightly, but also potentially try and make connections between these sort of two adjacent research practices that I have, which has always been a struggle for me personally, is trying to kind of think both of these things together in a productive way. So perhaps you can help me do that today. Briefly, just to introduce the sort of Queer Histories of Computing project. Over the past 5 years or so, I've been trying to engage in this project that seeks to think queerness and computation together, and in particular the relationship between computation as a kind of utopian and future-oriented practice, and queerness as a practice that's invested in a kind of radical critique that works against these sorts of narratives of progress and futurity, and tries to open up a space for what some have described as a kind of politics of failure. And so in this, I'm drawing on work over the last 20 years or so in queer theory, particularly the work of Lee Edelman and others who think about queerness as a kind of radical and embodied logic of failure, a failure not kind of in a universal sense, but rather a failure to achieve that which is sort of demanded of us by patriarchy, by neoliberalism, by capital, kind of a failure to conform to the norms and expectations around gender and sexuality, and also a failure to reproduce, both in a biological sense, or the kind of what they see as sacrificing the present for the promise of some kind of abstract future. That queerness instead is about a radical project of the present, and refuses the sort of supposed dream of some future that is not, or perhaps will never be realized, which is associated with particularly the figure of the child in some kind of future moment. So I saw this as interesting and useful, not only for its sort of abstract interest in queer theory, but rather because I see this utopian discourse as really relevant to the culture of computation as well, in which companies like Facebook and Google are kind of promising to connect us with friends or loved ones, to serve us advertisements that are catered specifically to our needs and desires, to shape our lived experiences in their entirety, so long as we sort of wait long enough and give up enough of ourselves to some kind of future promise that will one day happen. And I think any of us who use these technologies know that that utopian promise does not actually correspond with the lived daily experience of these technologies, which are often full of privacy violations, of bugs, of these kinds of small but I think consistent and ubiquitous challenges that we are nonetheless asked to ignore or pretend don't exist, because at some point, someday, we will perfect the algorithm and upload our consciousness into some utopian future ideal. So what I'm interested in is what a kind of queer politics of failure might offer a critique of the utopian promise of computation as a kind of broad cultural practice, I think, that extends into all areas of contemporary life, particularly through digital media technologies. So for the last 5 years or so, as I've said, I've kind of begun to dwell on a set of queer objects and queer practices within computational culture, kind of to try and answer this question of how we might think about queerness and computation together. And that really has run through a range of different kinds of objects and practices, from the work of queer artists like Zach Blass, who are trying to think about questions around things like biometrics and the politics of visibility, to things like the queer, or what I would call the queer culture of esoteric programming languages, and other kinds of non-normative media practices. This here is the Malbolgi programming language, which is sort of notoriously the most sort of difficult and in many ways useless programming language possible, but which is theoretically at least Turing complete and potentially could be made useful, but is deeply frustrating for all these other reasons that we can talk about if you're interested. To Two, of course, as the sort of topic of this talk was originally going to be the queer history of computing, which is, of course, rife with queer objects, queer practices, and perhaps most interestingly, queer subjects. Alan Turing here on the left, of course, being the most prominent of these. But really, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of prominent and interesting queer figures in the history of computing, whose lives, I think, offer an interesting critique of the way that we tell and understand the history of this particular technical form. But again, given the space that we find ourselves in today, I thought today I would instead turn this kind of queer critique toward the culture of contemporary images, and in particular, the way that they circulate within this sort of same computational culture that informs my larger project. So in this frame that I've set out for us today, I might begin by asking what then is a successful image and what is a failed one? What are the conditions under which each may be understood as such? Might these failed images be imagined or understood as corresponding with something that we might, in light of what I've just said, understand as a queer critique of photographic practices mediated as they've come to be by computational technology? Typically, I think most rendered images are these kinds of idealized things, the product of a kind of clear artistic and technical labor that by themselves I think is certainly worthy of analysis and critique. In fact, this is what most of my principal research project is today, which kind of looks to the history of 3D rendering technology from the 1960s on to the present, and tries to sort of find within them certain kinds of cultural logics that inform our contemporary visual culture. And yet the vast majority of images that we see and use on a daily basis are really no such thing. They in no way resemble this kind of ideal form, and correspond instead with what German artist and media theorist Hito Steyrl has called the poor image, which I took my glasses off, but is somewhere on the wall behind you right now. So in this sort of field-defining essay in defense of the poor image from 2009, Steyrl attempts to articulate the particularity of our contemporary visual culture through those images which have, by necessity, become small, lossy, transportable, and disposable. And far from this high-definition dream of an ever-improving visual simulation, Steyrl argues that the majority of our contemporary images are in fact poor in resolution, but rich in circulation. And I think this kind of image is familiar to all of us, as they're sort of the everyday of our visual culture. The visual mass that structures our lived environment, but which is quite often, I think, illegible to our way of seeing, as it's been shaped and informed to privilege the rich image in its fixity. And so it's in this sense that we might see a kind of queer valence to the poor image as that which is disavowed as impoverished, as failed, as abnormal, but it is in fact, I think, in many ways rich, complex, and perhaps most importantly, ubiquitous. So for Steyrl, the rich image is the cinematic or analog image, and the poor image is that which has been alienated from it and broken off as a clip, as a screenshot, a rip, or a bootleg. These images are impoverished and degraded through compression and reformatting, such that they threaten to disappear altogether. But what they lack in resolution, they make up for in speed and accessibility, and in their ability to copy and transform. Yet while they may appear in this sense poor by comparison, they are in fact thriving in their poverty, enabled by replication and recirculation. So Steyrl's poor images are the product then of their technological environment. They are materially shaped by its affordances and limitations. They are networked images, built to travel across a highly distributed and seemingly, at least on its surface, immaterial system. And yet, despite this apparent immaterial form as networked images, divorced from the analog modes of capture and reproduction, I think that they in fact visualize a deeply material aesthetic, in that it is precisely in their failure to fully reproduce the resolution of rich media that they sort of expose the workings of our machines themselves. So if the dream then of high resolution has been this sort of parabolic approach of screen technology towards something like verisimilitude, the sort of inching closer and closer to a lifelike visual representation, while nonetheless disavowing itself as a kind of technical apparatus. And this, I think, is very much the kind of ideological critique that a kind of queer failure offers us, to kind of point to this process and name it. These images really, I think, refuse that impulse altogether. Instead of conceal their technological origins, they lay them bare. They unabashedly fail at hiding their mediation, and in this failure they fall out of their familiarity to us, such that we might begin to interrogate the process by which they are rendered visible at all. So it's this failure that makes them visible to us as more than simple simulations of some existing form, and which breaks the future-driven narrative of the perfect or perfectible image through a surprising and, we might argue, potentially queer critique. So to understand what I mean here, I think it will be useful to examine a particular form of poor image for the material traces that we might begin to interrogate. In other words, to sort of read a poor image for the theory of the world that it articulates. And taking these images seriously, my hope at least, is that we cease to see them as somehow peripheral to our contemporary visual culture and come to understand the central role that they play, in spite of, or perhaps precisely because of, their imperfection and failure. So it should be no surprise that these images tend toward a particular form or style, what I would think of as a kind of vernacular aesthetic, which is a different one of my sort of words that I perhaps abuse and overuse with regards to these kinds of questions. They're designed to spread and to replicate, and while the vast majority of images online might be considered poor by Steirl's definition, we might consider memes, macros, conspiracy images, clickbait, and other so-called viral images as particularly exemplary of this form. These images make little effort to reproduce the singularity or originality of some analog referent, but are instead sort of unabashedly formulaic. Take, for example, this image. So, I'll take a sip of beer while you look at this image. This image is a photograph. I guess that itself maybe is a debatable claim. A photograph uploaded by the popular musician and actor Ludacris to his personal Instagram account in December of 2014. A strange and perhaps surprising image. It's emblematic of an entire genre of image production that has been crudely dubbed shit pics, because in the words of popular culture writer Brian Feldman, quote, "they look like shit," end quote. So these images are the product of complex practice of uploading, screen capping, filtering, cropping, and re-uploading an image ad nauseum. Through its iterative process, the image is distorted and changed, and after each circuit, leaving a visible shift or mark that may be read in an almost archaeological way. Over time, so just to give you a sense of the genre, over time the image blurs and fades, pixelates, and artifacts until we're left with a specter of the original, a referent that may serve the same purpose as its earlier iterations, but has become, I think, something altogether different. How then did this image become so thoroughly abstracted, so poor? So this image began its life as any other, taken or found and then uploaded online. This particular image began its life as a photograph taken by Julie O'Neill for the Cater's news agency as part of a story on orphaned orangutans. The original image appeared online in mid-2014, but quickly began to circulate via image aggregating sites devoted to cute animals, decontextualized from its original upload, or indeed from the original photographer herself, who is not named. These included the Turkish social content platforms 8list and Oneido, followed by a Saudi Arabian content aggregator, Abu Nawaf, and finally a US-based animal blog called justcuteanimals.com. So each of these circuits is, I think, clearly indicated here by the logo or watermark that appears below the image, attached to it but not radically transforming it. Though interestingly, you really can see, especially I think, on this screen, the sort of subtle distinction between each, even at this early stage. Already we see a certain kind of vernacular practice taking shape in the way in which this kind of image circulates and multiplies online. These images are, by and large, will have been published by various sources of so-called original content for use on sites whose profits are driven by the advertising revenue of people interested in this case, cute animals. These images then continue to travel through shares and reposts on social media sites such as Facebook and Tumblr, and they function as the kind of visual equivalent of like a chain email or a cute cat calendar or something kind of between the two. They serve a kind of general interest, and through that interest they spread. Throughout all of this, the image remains relatively unscathed, occasionally resized and adjusted as you've seen here, particularly for contrast and color, but largely homogeneous. Our first radical transformation, then, is a shift from image to meme, an act that we can trace at minimum to the Instagram account at blackgirlproblems_official, established in March of 2014 and run by a now 18-year-old girl named Erin with 51.7 thousand followers. So there are a few clues here that this is likely our original image, or at least of this particular iteration of this image, posted in October of 2014. The caption, you can see, is centered and sharp, and has not yet degraded into the kind of greenish smear that we can see in the final image. The picture of the monkey is also clear, and all of the text on the watermark is legible. It's quite likely that even this image was taken from somewhere else, of course, and then appropriated by this particular user for this particular social network. But this is as far back as our archaeological gesture can take us. The image itself follows the popular format of when you or when you're, and this one rings particularly true for me, repurposing and recontextualizing found images for comedic effect through the addition of text and emoji to convey a kind of common or shared experience. Of course, there's a great deal that we could say here about the content of these images. We could kind of analyze them and their visual or cultural function, or read them as a kind of textual practice if we wanted. I could note, for example, the explicit ties between this vernacular image form and the subcultural or political practices that are often called, at least in the US, Black Twitter or Black Instagram, a collective of active Black identified users who've created a virtual community that has proven effective in bringing about a wide range of socio-political changes, in addition to producing their own cultural and textual practices, such as the memes that we see here. We could, in other words, read this image for the rich cultural context of this perhaps aesthetically poor image. But I think this is to mistake the image for the render, which is to say what interests me here is less the content or meaning of this image and more the question of what this image distills, captures, and fixes, the conditions under which it's made legible as an image as such. So to understand this process, I think instead we must attend to the means by which such an image could be rendered so impoverished to begin with. That is, how it could be transformed from this into this. So to appreciate this transformation, we have to understand the context in which the image circulates. It's a networked image, to be sure, but it's also the product of a particular platform, Instagram, with its own unique norms and formal limitations. Indeed, these limitations are what distinguish one image-sharing platform from another and what encourage the forms that are particular to each. Instagram, for example, encourages the taking and sharing of personal photographs intended to be viewed by friends and followers, but which cannot be captured or reproduced within the app itself. Other than now, I think fairly lately, you can save an image to be viewed within the app, but you can't extract an image from the app in order to use it elsewhere. So while other social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter encourage the sharing, reposting, and retweeting of content from other users, Instagram discourages both implicitly in the kind of promotional material that you see here. Never, I think, has Instagram advertised itself as a platform for sharing meme content, for example. So instead we have this very typical and singular style or aesthetic, the sort of, taking photos of your beautiful breakfast kind of form. But also in the technological restrictions that are built into the platform. So when using Instagram on a mobile device, users cannot download images from their feed onto their phones. Such a feature simply does not exist. Since the majority of users engage with Instagram on platforms from these kinds of proprietary mobile devices, there are few workarounds for this system, such that if one wishes to download or capture another user's image, they have to take a screenshot of their entire display and, using Instagram or another application, crop out any unwanted visual information so that the image may be uploaded again. In effect, one must photograph the photograph. And to this, the ability to add filters, or rather add this to the ability to add filters, effects, or watermarks with each subsequent upload, and we begin to see how this deterioration takes place. So it's clear that this image was saved and uploaded many, many times. As you can see, for example, that the text is cut off on the left side of the frame, and then there are slight black bars at the top and bottom of the image, only kind of slightly visible here. This is from, presumably, improper cropping. The word black in the watermark at Black Girl Problems Official has been washed away, absorbed into the blanket behind it as the image progressively darkened and distorted over time. The greenish cloud around the top caption, that's barely visible here as well, indicates that the image has been compressed and recompressed dozens of times, and perhaps most baffling of all is the appearance of the rule of thirds grid, which you can see here over the main image, which exists as part of the Instagram upload interface, such that in order for this to be included as a layer in our final image, one would have to screen cap the image, begin to upload it via Instagram, screen cap the upload process itself, and then re-upload this second image. Which, why would anyone do that? It is entirely unclear. There's no indication as to why someone would do this, yet it has nonetheless become part of our final image. The last stage of this process is the addition of the translucent gray border, crediting the source account for where the image was found, which was a feature made possible by third-party software. Though it should be noted, of course, that neither the producer of the original meme nor the photographer of the original image are the person credited. So I know I've dwelled on this for quite some time, and it's a silly image, of course, but peeling back the layers of this image in this way, I think, reveals a unique set of practices. It reveals the process by which digital images such as this are produced, managed, and structured. In a sense, it visualizes the movement of the image across the network. It makes visible the material infrastructure that enabled this image to come into being, and in doing so calls into question, I think, one of the earliest myths of the digital, which is the belief that digital objects have no material basis, no original, and can therefore be copied endlessly without loss or transformation. And indeed, this ability to copy data with no loss to the original is sort of one of the principal features that differentiates digital technologies from their analog counterparts, at least in theory. Fred Richin, who's currently the dean of the School at the International Center for Photography in New York, I think articulates this most clearly in his 2009 book, After Photography. For Richin, and I'll just read this quote briefly so everyone doesn't have to sit in silence together. Digital is based on an architecture of infinitely reproducible, or repeatable rather, abstractions, in which the original and its copy are the same. Analog ages and rots, diminishing over generations, changing its sound, its look, its smell. In the analog world, the photograph of the photograph is always one generation removed, fuzzier, not the same. The digital copy of the digital photograph is indistinguishable, so that original loses its meaning, end quote. So in some senses, this is true. In theory, this is true, but it doesn't take into account the environment in which media circulates and resides, or their everyday use and cultural function beyond their initial design. Our image is the product of precisely this form of use, a use that was not designed for an improper use, perhaps a queer use. I don't want to extend the metaphor too far. To be sure, it's possible to create and share images without this degradation. as should be clear from the fact that I can still dig out and show you earlier copies of our picture, like geological strata marking this transformation over time. In this sense, our image is not typical. It is the product, rather, of a particular practice born out of the limits of a specific platform. It's an effect taken to such an extreme that it becomes visibly present, but it nonetheless points to a larger precarity or lossiness that is present across digital media. Indeed, the vast majority of contemporary technologies and media that structure our contemporary environment are lossy. Which is to say that they are encoded and compressed in order to make them smaller, easier to use, and faster to upload and download. As part of this process, a digital object loses some part of itself, which is why it has this name: resolution, depth, clarity, or precision. JPEGs, AVIs, MP3s, and many other popular file formats use lossy compression. And it's one of the reasons that digital images, movies, and music often cannot compare to their analog counterparts, as the vast majority of lossy formats are designed for efficiency over fidelity. And even if it is possible to store and compress data in ways such that no data is lost, that is, losslessly, there are many lossless compression formats, in practice, true losslessness is impossible. Data degrades, software rots, machines fail. And yet we hold on to the belief that we might capture and preserve onto this desire for a kind of lossless historical object. Indeed, I think we could argue that lossiness is the principal fantasy of historical production, that is the notion that we might one day reconstruct a perfect representation of the past through those objects that remain. This fantasy is played out quite eloquently, I think, in the 2010 short video work Killing Lena by Canadian artist Jamie Allen, a meditation on digital image compression and standardization over the past 40 years. The piece consists of an image of the model Lena Soderberg, which slowly degrades over the course of several minutes, pixelating and artifacting until the figure effectively disappears. The audio we have is going to come out of my computer, so hopefully you can hear it. So the effect is achieved by running the image repeatedly through a compression algorithm, the kind that are used to save the vast majority of contemporary digital images. The result is dramatic, but these artifacts are commonplace among digital images, a product of the way in which lossy algorithms remove visual data in an effort to reduce the size of an image file. In Allen's piece, the choice of image is crucial, as the 512 by 512 pixel image of Lena is perhaps the most famous standard test image in the field of image processing, and is also somewhere on that wall, I believe, maybe, I think. And in particular for the testing of image compression algorithms, such as this one. It is in effect the source image for what would eventually become the JPEG and MPEG image formats that we use today. The image itself is taken from the November 1972 centerfold of Playboy magazine and is cropped to remove any nudity. As told by Alexander Sawchuk, one of the researchers responsible for its standardization, in June or July of 1973, while working alongside a graduate student and the lab manager at the University of Southern California's Signal and Image Processing Institute, or SIPI, Sawchuk was hurriedly searching the lab for a good image to scan for a colleague's conference paper. They were tired of the stock of usual test images dating back to the televisual standards of the early 1960s and wanted something glossy to ensure good output and dynamic range with a human face. Quote, just then somebody happened to walk in with a recent issue of Playboy, end quote. And such a standard was born. This anecdote is really quite typical of these sorts of histories. I do a great deal of work on graphical standards like the Utah Teapot, and it's also full of this kind of anecdotal narration. and I think reflects both the gendered dynamic of early research labs in the 1970s, as well as the longevity of text images once they have been standardized. There was a really strong movement in the 1990s to stop using this image because it was clearly sexist, and yet it still persists, though perhaps is less common than it once was. Jamie Allen's Killing Lena meditates on Lena's image as one that was conscripted into the production of a technical practice. By repeatedly exposing her image to the algorithms she unwittingly helped to develop, her image becomes divorced from its historical context, abstracted, unrecoverable. In this sense, the film reflects on the lossy nature of all digital imaging and on the ways we remember or perhaps come to forget the cultural history of these technical practices. Now, it may seem that the images that I've chosen to dwell on here today are sort of exceptional in their extremity. They're sort of strange and particular in various ways, but I think that they point toward the universal. In other words, in the particularity of the processes that these images render visible, they articulate a theory of the world with clear desires and investments: speed, translation, transformation, circulation, etc. Moreover, in their poverty, they make visible a lossiness that is inherent to all digital objects, a loss that we constantly disavow in our refusal to acknowledge such images as successful, normal, and ideal. And I think here again we begin to see this sort of normative, non-normative distinction that I'd like to be drawing out here today. Here we begin to surface the critical frame that our theory of the image makes possible. In rendering something visible, we necessarily restrict and limit that which is legible to us. As such, this rendering is as much invested in the production of invisibility as it is in the production of the visible, a sort of restricting of vision such that an illegible object can begin to appear. This negotiation of visibility offers us a kind of vector along which we might situate our analysis, a means of contrast, and a means to distinguish the unique claims that each image form might make. So having dived really deep, I think, into a very particular and perhaps unfamiliar territory, we might now resurface where we began, that is with the clean, polished, and beautifully rendered images that are the sort of aspirational ground for so much of our visual culture. That is the HD image, the retina display image, the 3D image, and so on. Simply put, the supposed richness of the digital. So these rich images function, I think, in effect, as the visual capital of our digital culture. They are the foil to the poor, feeding it images to compress and transform. And yet, in a sense, I think they're not so different, in that each is in many ways the product of a similar logic. In other words, while the poor may serve or perhaps offer a queer critique of the presumed richness of some promised future, once we've uncovered that critique, we may begin to see the rich image for what it already was. It is, as much as the poor, marked by computation, but unlike the poor image, what it seeks to hide is the immense labor of its own production. So if our first image is shaped by the network as a highly distributed and seemingly immaterial system, then the rich image is shaped by those sites at which the image labors and is labored upon, those sites at which its definition is most clearly felt. So in keeping with our previous analysis, we might turn now to interrogate this process through an investigation of the material specificity of the rich image itself, examining what this mode of production tells us about the unique ways in which we imagine, engage with, and indeed render the world today in service of computation. So while it may not be readily apparent from the way we use and interact with computers on a day-to-day basis, digital imaging is in fact, and perhaps many of you know this here, being people who work with and think about images quite a bit, this form of image production is in fact some of the most computationally demanding work that one can do, and requires an immense amount of labor to be produced. Since at least the 1970s, most computers, both personal and professional, have included specific hardware devoted exclusively to the processing of images. From the earliest frame buffers that allowed for interactive mapping of pixels onto the screen of a cathode ray tube, to the now ubiquitous graphical processing unit, or GPU, found in any computational device that outputs to a screen. No other process requires this amount of dedicated hardware, at least not any other process that your computer performs. More than any other applications, things like games and video editing, 3D modeling, and other graphically intense processes require the full attention of any system. And to work professionally excuse me, with digital images often requires a high-end computer that's exclusively devoted to this task. So all this is to say that these images are far from effortless, even if they want to presume the appearance of a kind of effortless production. This is particularly true of large-scale graphical production for things like computer-generated films and special effects, which is maybe less traditionally photographic than some of the images we've just looked at, but is sort of what my own research area is in, particularly 3D graphical modeling, so I'm going to talk about it briefly now. Studios such as Pixar, for example, have for over 30 years required massive facilities for the processing and output of images. These render farms, as they are called, consist of hundreds or even thousands of machines that are linked together for the simultaneous computation of graphical data. While the size of a render farm can fluctuate based on the needs of a particular production, they tend toward the massive. Pixar's current farm, for example, peaks at around 1,300 machines, which is over 1,000 computers working simultaneously all day, every day in the production of a simulated realism. Unlike other hardware technologies, which are often mapped onto sort of the exponential growth of what's often called Moore's law, render times for computer graphics have actually, since the 1980s, remained entirely flat. It takes between 2 and 4 hours to render a single frame of a computer-animated film, which is the same as it did in 1983. While the processing power of computers, of course, has improved over time, the demand for more realistic images has grown to match, along with the development of increasingly sophisticated algorithms for lighting, shading, movement, and texture. And so for a 90-minute feature film, the final rendering, not taking into account the thousands of low-resolution renderings done in the design and testing of a film, takes on average about 270 days to produce, which is 270 days of around-the-clock computation by a render farm consisting of upwards of 1,300 computers. Which is a lot of computer time. And while this labor may be in some ways largely material, or immaterial rather, its effects are really far from it. The past 3 years or so, a great deal of research has been conducted on the environmental footprint of data centers and server farms used to run the vast majority of internet services today. A recent study, for example, by the Global E-Sustainability Initiative found that data center web service, such as those used by Google and Facebook, are to blame for about 2% of greenhouse gas emissions, which is about the same as all air travel combined. Much of these environmental costs could just as easily be applied to the production of rich graphical images, though I know of no studies into the environmental impact of this kind of labor. These sleek facilities demand a massive amount of energy to run and even more to keep them cool, the environmental effect of which is certainly not inconsequential. These figures only grow when we consider that a great deal of render services are themselves networked. Companies without dedicated facilities to produce graphically rich images will often outsource that computational labor to facilities elsewhere, adding to the global impact of these images and their effect on environmental precarity. These companies also always have these weird, I think they take the sort of metaphor of a farm and then apply them very literally, and always have this sort of pastoral and kind of like, you know, we're just growing your images over here, even though they are destroying the environment. So increasingly also this outsourcing of computational labor occurs along a north-south axis, exploiting cheap labor and lax regulations in countries such as China, Turkey, and India. While outsourced render services in the US, for example, cost between 25 cents and $45 an hour on average. In India, the average price per hour ranges from 5 cents to as low as 1.8 cents. There is once again a kind of disjoint or disavowal here between the veneer of the rich image and the content, or the context rather, in which it is produced. This is a render farm in Mumbai, and this is the sort of splash page that it has. It's called Render Monk, and this is a Google Street View of the location of that facility. or at least as close as one can get on Google Street View. Perhaps most alarming in this transformation over the past 10 years is the scale and logic of these services as applied to a wide range of non-visual applications. Given the efficiency with which GPUs are able to process relatively fixed and highly repetitive tasks, they have in recent years been modified for use in non-graphical computing, often called general purpose GPUs or GPGPUs, and redeployed en masse for the purposes of big data analysis, artificial intelligence, computer vision, and cryptocurrency mining, perhaps most troublingly, which has caused the price of GPUs to skyrocket. So in this sense, the material and historical logic of the rich image has come to shape a wide range of practices that define much of our computational culture, but which are not necessarily in and of themselves explicitly visual. These images, in spite of, or perhaps due to their richness, reflect a much larger system of global precarity tied to climate change and globalization, enabled by the flow of networks and the product of contemporary capitalism. Put simply, the apparent richness of these images is predicated on the erasure of the conditions of their production, consumption, storage, and circulation. That is, the material condition that enables them. Thus, in examining the future promise of the rich image, we once again find sort of a promise unfulfilled, much in the same way as we began with the promise of computational technology writ large. So ultimately, I have no solutions to offer, though the promise of some future solution, I think, works against the goals of this kind of queer critique that seeks to destabilize the presumed fixity of these oppositional categories of rich and poor. If anything, my goal is to shift focus toward those practices that shape and enable the production of these images, such that we might find new ways of living in and visualizing the present that do not presume the promise of some future perfect image. Thank you very much.